I don't really know what made me think camping in a graveyard was a good idea. I guess it was a mix of boredom, curiosity, and that kind of stubborn pride where you want to prove to yourself you're not easily scared. It was late October 2016 when the idea came to me. I was 24 at the time, fresh out of college, stuck in a quiet town in northern Pennsylvania, and looking for anything to make the nights less dull. There was an old cemetery about 2 miles from the edge of town, the kind of place everyone whispered about but nobody really visited anymore. The graves went back to the 1800s, broken stones leaning at odd angles, weeds taking over the paths, and parts of the rusty iron fence bent or missing. I'd walked past it during the day a few times, and it always gave off this heavy stillness, the kind where even birds didn't seem to hang around too long. One Friday evening, I packed a small backpack with a tent, sleeping bag, flashlight, some food, and a small camping stove. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't want people calling me an idiot or trying to tag along. This was about me testing myself, seeing if I could spend a full night in a place most people avoided after sunset. The walk there wasn't bad. The air had that late fall bite, where you could smell dried leaves and distant with smoke from chimneys. I reached the entrance of the cemetery just as the last bit of daylight was draining from the sky, a dull orange glow fading into a cold blue. The gate was half open, one side rusted permanently into the dirt, and I slipped through without much effort. Inside, the ground was uneven, with dips where the older graves had sunk. Some stones had completely fallen over, others were chipped so badly the names were unreadable. I set my tent near the back corner of the cemetery, where there was a small clearing under a twisted oak tree. It was far enough from the road that passing headlights wouldn't reach me, but close enough that I could make a quick exit if I needed to. I laid out my sleeping bag, fired up the small stove, and boiled water for noodles. It felt strange eating in silence there. Even in the woods, you usually hear crickets, owls, or rustling branches, but the graveyard was quiet in a different way. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like the air pressed against your ears. The occasional gust of wind made the tree branches creak, and once in a while a dry leaf would tumble across the gravel paths, but otherwise it was just stillness. As night fully took over, the temperature dropped fast. My breath fogged in front of my flashlight beam. I turned off the light for a while, letting my eyes adjust, and the graves became strange silhouettes, rows of uneven shapes that seemed closer than they had before. I sat there, forcing myself not to turn the flashlight back on too quickly, telling myself this was exactly why I came, to sit in the discomfort and see if I could handle it. Sometime around midnight, I started hearing noises. Not voices, not footsteps exactly, just sharp cracks and rustles. At first, I thought it was the wind knocking a branch loose, or maybe a raccoon moving between the stones. But the sounds didn't fade. Every few minutes there was another noise, sometimes behind me, sometimes farther out, as if someone was pacing slowly around the perimeter of the cemetery. I told myself it had to be an animal. The woods bordered the back of the cemetery, so maybe a deer had wandered close. Still, the timing of the noises made me uneasy. They were steady, not random, almost like deliberate movements. I got back into my tent, zipped it up, and tried to convince myself to sleep. But lying there in the dark only made every sound worse. The nylon walls of the tent might as well have been paper, offering no real protection, and every time I heard crunching leaves outside, my body tensed up. I pulled the sleeping bag over my head, but my mind kept running, imagining scenarios I didn't want to think about. Around 1 in the morning, I heard something closer, right outside the tent. The sound was sharp, like a boot stepping on a stick. My heart jumped into my throat. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it at the thin wall. A shadow stretched across the fabric, tall and narrow. It wasn't moving like an animal. It stood there for a moment, then shifted slowly to the side. I held my breath, not daring to make a sound. I told myself it could be a trick of the light, maybe a branch caught in the wind, but the way it moved didn't fit. Felt too controlled. I stayed frozen, listening. Then I heard a faint metallic sound, like something brushing against the old iron fence. That was enough. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, flashlight in hand, and peeked outside. The beam swept across crooked gravestones and dark patches of grass, but nothing moved. My chest felt tight, my ears straining for anything, but all I caught was the cold wind. I didn't get back in the tent. Instead, I sat outside on a low stone, flashlight in one hand and a small pocket knife in the other, trying to keep my nerves in check. The minutes dragged on painfully. At some point, I heard the sound again. Slow steps, crunching leaves, definitely not a raccoon. This time it came from deeper in the graveyard, near a row of tilted stones. I swung the flashlight in that direction and caught a glimpse of something, a figure slipping behind a large monument. It was human. I was sure of it. My stomach turned. Someone else was in there with me. All the childish dares and self-challenges suddenly didn't matter. I wasn't alone, and whoever it was had been circling my camp for hours. My first instinct was to pack up and run, but I knew trying to take down the tent in the dark would slow me down. I shoved my sleeping bag back in the pack, left the stove and a few things behind, and decided I'd cut straight across the cemetery to the road. The walk out was the longest 15 minutes of my life. Every few steps, I stopped and swung the flashlight around, expecting to see the figure again. My legs felt like stone, stiff and heavy, and the silence made my heartbeat sound impossibly loud in my ears. When I finally reached the gate, I didn't look back. I ran the whole 2 miles back to town, lungs burning in the cold air, until I was standing under the harsh yellow glow of the first streetlight. The next day, I went back in daylight with the excuse of retrieving the stuff I'd left behind. The stove was still there, sitting on the grass where I had dropped it. But about 20 feet from my tent, I saw something I hadn't noticed the night before. Fresh footprints in the dirt, clearly from boots, not sneakers. They circled my tent, looping in uneven paths, then trailed off toward the woods at the far end of the cemetery. That's when it hit me fully. Someone else had been out there, watching, moving around me while I tried to sleep. Maybe they were just passing through, maybe they were curious, or maybe they had darker reasons for being there. I didn't stick around to figure it out. I gathered my things, left the graveyard for good, and swore to myself I'd never try something that reckless again. Camping in a graveyard wasn't scary because of ghosts or legends. It was scary because it reminded me how exposed we are when we think we're alone, how easy it is for someone with bad intentions to step quietly into the dark and stay just out of sight. That night proved something to me, but not what I expected. I didn't come away feeling brave. I came away understanding that sometimes the real danger isn't in our imagination. It's in the very real footsteps circling us while we're lying in the dark, pretending to be safe. I had been planning that hunting trip for months. It was the fall of 2011, and I was 27 at the time, still working long shifts at a warehouse in Ohio. The only thing I looked forward to was getting away for a weekend with my rifle, some supplies, and a patch of woods where no one bothered me. I chose a remote section of the Wayne National Forest, far from any of the common campsites. It was early October, the air sharp and cold at night, but still bearable with the right gear. I packed light, but enough to last 3 days. A tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, cans of food, jerky, water filter, and my Remington 700. The spot I picked was off an unmarked dirt path I had found the year before. You had to park off the main road, hike a mile through thick trees, and then climb a ridge. On top of that ridge, there was a flat clearing just big enough for a tent and a fire pit someone had left behind years ago. That clearing overlooked a deep hollow where deer often wandered in the early mornings. It was perfect. I got there around noon the first day. The hike in was quiet, just the crunch of leaves under my boots and the sound of squirrels darting up trees. I set up camp quickly, drove the stakes into the hard ground, and unrolled my sleeping bag inside the tent. I stacked some wood for a fire later, then spent the afternoon scouting the hollow with my binoculars. I saw fresh tracks, even some droppings. There were deer around, no doubt. By sunset, I cooked some beans and jerky on the stove and sat near the fire, the woods already darkening around me. The sound of the forest at night can be calming, but it can also play tricks on you. Every snap of a twig feels closer than it is. Every rustle in the leaves sounds heavier than a rabbit. I camped enough to know not to jump at everything, but still, the quiet can get inside your head. That first night passed without much. I woke up once around 2 a.m. when I thought I heard footsteps outside the tent, but after listening closely, it was probably just a deer or raccoon moving through. I told myself to settle down and eventually drifted back off. The second day was when things started to feel different. I woke at dawn, made some instant coffee, and sat at the ridge edge waiting for movement. Around 7 a.m., I spotted a buck further down the hollow. I tracked it for an hour but couldn't get a clean shot before it disappeared deeper into the trees. I let it go and returned to camp for lunch. That afternoon, while I was cleaning my rifle near the fire pit, I noticed something odd about the ground nearby. About 20 feet from my tent, just past the line of trees, there were marks in the dirt. At first, I thought they were old boot prints, but when I crouched down, I saw they were fresher than I expected. The soil was damp from rain the night before, and the prints had sharp edges like they were no more than a few hours old. They weren't mine. The treads were different, larger, heavier. I hadn't seen another car parked anywhere on the dirt road. I told myself maybe it was another hunter who came through early in the morning, passing by without me noticing. But the thought bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I didn't like the idea of someone else knowing where I was camping, especially since I picked this spot for how secluded it was. That night, I kept the fire lower than usual. I cooked, ate, and then sat listening. The woods were alive with crickets and owls, but every so often, the normal rhythm of the forest seemed to pause, like something bigger was moving. Once, I thought I heard the sound of brush being pushed aside deliberately, not like an animal, but like a person trying to move quietly. My stomach tightened, and I stayed awake long into the night, gripping my rifle across my lap in the tent. Sometime past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, faint but steady, circling just outside the clearing. I held my breath and didn't move. The steps stopped, then silence. My heart was pounding so loud I thought it would give me away. I sat like that for what felt like hours, every muscle tense, until finally exhaustion won and I must have drifted off around dawn. When I came out of the tent that morning, I saw them, clear as day, footprints circling the entire camp. They were larger than mine, wide-soled boots. Whoever it was had walked a full loop around the clearing, stopping near the fire pit, then near the tent, then back into the trees. My stomach sank. This wasn't an accident. Someone had been watching me. I thought hard about leaving right then. Packing up and heading back to the truck made sense, but stubbornness or pride held me there. I told myself I had my rifle, I wasn't helpless, and maybe it was nothing more than some other hunter curious about me being there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being stalked. That last day was unbearable. I couldn't focus on hunting. Every sound behind me made me spin around. Every gust of wind in the branches above sounded like someone whispering. I barely ate, just chewed on jerky while pacing the clearing. By evening, I had made up my mind to leave at first light. That night, I didn't light a fire. I sat in the dark with my rifle ready. The cold crept in, but fear kept me awake. Around midnight, I heard it again. The slow crunch of leaves. Not rushing, not stumbling like a deer, but careful, deliberate steps. They came closer, then stopped. I waited, staring into the black tree line, eyes straining for movement. Nothing. The silence pressed down harder than the noise. I must have nodded off out of pure exhaustion because the next thing I remember was a faint gray light seeping into the tent. I scrambled out, heart racing, and looked around. More footprints, fresh ones. They had come closer this time, right up to the flap of my tent. Whoever it was had stood there in the dark, only a thin layer of nylon between us. That broke me. I packed in a rush, barely eating, stuffing gear into my pack with shaking hands. I didn't care about the mess or what I left behind. I slung the rifle over my shoulder and started down the ridge. Every step down that trail, I felt eyes on my back. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following. When I finally reached the truck, the relief almost dropped me to my knees. But then I saw something that froze me in place. In the thin layer of dirt on the hood of my truck, there were handprints. Not smudges, not dust streaks, but clear handprints where someone had leaned over and looked inside the windshield. I drove out of those woods faster than I should have, gravel spitting out from under the tires. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway. Even then, I kept checking the rearview mirror the whole way home. I never went back to that spot again. I still hunt sometimes, but never alone, and never that deep in the forest. Whoever was out there knew I was by myself, and they wanted me to know they were there too. The deer, the camping, all of it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that I had been followed, watched, and circled for days without ever seeing a face. The scariest part wasn't the prints or the hand marks on the truck. It was knowing that whoever it was, they never tried to hide the fact that they were there. They wanted me to know, and that thought has stayed with me every time I close my eyes in the dark. I decided to take a short trip out into the English countryside in the summer of 2014. I was 23 at the time, broke but restless, and I wanted to get away from the city noise for a few days. I didn't have money for hostels or hotels, so I packed up my old tent, a secondhand sleeping bag, and a cheap backpack I'd been dragging around since university. I caught a train to Somerset, then a bus that dropped me near a small village, and from there I walked. It was one of those warm, sticky evenings where the air smells of grass and soil, and I remember thinking I'd made the right decision. The fields stretched out wide on both sides, green hedgerows dividing them, and a line of woods in the distance that looked like a good place to set up camp. I'd printed out some walking routes beforehand, but I decided I'd just find a quiet spot off the path and pitch my tent. By the time I'd hiked into the edge of the woods, the sky was turning orange. I found a clearing not too far from a narrow dirt trail. The ground was soft but dry, covered in pine needles and leaves, and the trees blocked the wind. I set up my small tent, boiled water on my little camping stove, and ate a packet of noodles. It was simple, but I felt free. As the sun set, the woods darkened fast. The light drained out of the trees, and all I could hear were insects, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional bird. I lay back inside my tent, the flap half open, watching the last bit of daylight fade. I don't know how long I lay there, but at some point, I noticed movement near the trail. At first, I thought it was a deer, but the shape was too tall and still. It was a man. He was standing in the distance, maybe 30 or 40 feet away, just beyond the clearing. He wasn't walking or moving, just standing there, half hidden in the shadows of the trees. I froze, my first thought being that I was trespassing on private land and he was some local angry about me camping here. But the way he stood didn't feel right. He wasn't looking at the tent directly, more like facing slightly to the side, but his posture was stiff, almost like he'd been standing there for a while. I sat still inside my tent, heart thudding. Eventually, I convinced myself I was imagining it, or maybe it was just someone walking home along the path. I zipped the tent shut, telling myself to ignore it. I lay in my sleeping bag, but every small noise outside made me flinch. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. It all felt louder than it should. I barely slept that night. In the morning, the clearing looked normal again. Sunlight cut through the branches, birds were chirping, and everything felt safe. I got up, stretched, and tried to laugh it off. I told myself it must have been a trick of the light, or maybe just a hiker passing by at the wrong time. I spent the day walking along trails, eating snacks, and sitting by a stream reading a paperback I'd brought. Nothing strange happened, and I started to relax again. That night, though, it was different. I set up a small fire with dry sticks I'd collected, just enough to cook a tin of beans and keep me company while I sat outside the tent. It was quiet, too quiet. Even the insects seemed hushed. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps far off, but when I stopped and listened, there was nothing but silence. I doused the fire, climbed into my tent, and zipped it shut. I was just starting to drift off when I heard it again. Slow footsteps on the trail. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Whoever it was wasn't in a hurry. I held my breath, every muscle tight. The steps grew closer until they sounded like they were right by the clearing. I didn't dare unzip the tent or move. I just lay there in the dark, listening. Then the steps stopped, dead silent. My skin prickled as I realized whoever it was had stopped just a few feet away. The sound of breathing reached me, faint but steady, like someone standing still and trying not to be noticed. I clenched my fists, telling myself not to panic. After what felt like forever, the breathing faded, the steps moved away slowly, and eventually the woods fell silent again. I stayed awake until dawn, every sound amplified in my ears. When light finally came, I crawled out of the tent, exhausted. I looked around the clearing and my stomach dropped. Just beyond the trees, pressed into the dirt, were boot prints. Clear, fresh, deep. They led right up to the edge of my camp and then back toward the path. I packed my things quickly, hands shaking, and decided to move deeper into the woods, further off the trail. I didn't want to risk whoever it was finding me again. I walked for an hour before setting up in another clearing. It was harder to get comfortable now. Every time the wind moved branches, I jumped. Every rustle felt like it was being made by someone watching. That evening, I tried not to make a fire, thinking maybe the smoke had drawn attention the night before. I sat in the dark, eating bread and cheese from my bag, staring into the blackness. Around midnight, I heard something again, this time not on the trail, but closer, moving through the undergrowth. Slow, deliberate steps. Crunch. Stop. Crunch. Stop. My heart raced as I realized whoever it was had followed me. The steps circled, never rushing, just moving in a slow arc around the clearing. I could hear twigs snapping, leaves being brushed aside. Whoever it was stayed just out of sight. I lay inside my tent, gripping the handle of a small camping knife I'd brought, though I knew it wouldn't do much. The circling went on for what felt like hours, and then it stopped completely. No steps, no breathing, nothing. I couldn't tell if the man had gone or was just standing out there in the dark. At first light, I forced myself out of the tent. My legs felt weak and I wanted to be sick. I scanned the ground around my camp and found more prints, this time much closer, as if the man had walked all the way around the clearing. There were cigarette butts near a tree too, still smelling faintly of smoke. That was it for me. I stuffed my gear into my bag, didn't even bother folding the tent properly, and started walking as fast as I could toward the village. I didn't stop to eat or drink. I just kept going, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. My nerves were shot, my whole body tense. When I finally stumbled out of the woods and onto a narrow road, I nearly cried with relief. A car came by after half an hour, and I flagged it down, pretending I was just a lost hiker. The driver dropped me near the bus stop, and I got out of that area as fast as I could. I never found out who the man was or why he was out there watching me, following me. Maybe he was some local who didn't like outsiders, maybe he was just unwell, or maybe he had worse intentions I don't even want to think about. What stuck with me was the way he moved, slow, patient, deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world to wait and watch. Even now, years later, I can't camp alone anymore. Every time I try, I hear footsteps in the dark, slow and steady, circling just out of sight. I had been planning a short camping trip alone for weeks. It was late summer of 2013, and I had just turned 22. I didn't have much money, but I wanted a break from everything: work, city noise, people. I packed light: a small green tent, a cheap sleeping bag, a cooler with a few cans of beans, water bottles, a pocket knife, a flashlight, and a box of matches. I drove out of Birmingham early in the morning, heading into the countryside of Shropshire. I picked a spot near a wooded area that I had read about online, a place where not many people went, but still accessible by a small dirt track. The air was heavy and warm when I parked the car at the side of the narrow road. My boots pressed into the grass as I carried my bag and gear into the woods. I walked for maybe 20 minutes before I found a small clearing. The grass was short, the trees tall, and there was enough open space to see the sky. I could still hear the occasional sound of cars in the distance, but it felt like I was somewhere far away. I pitched the tent slowly, trying to make it neat, even though I wasn't very good at it. By the time I finished, my shirt was damp with sweat, and I sat on the ground to catch my breath. The smell of dirt and pine was strong, and flies buzzed around my arms. I cracked open a bottle of water and lay on my back, staring at the clouds drift above the treeline. Most of the afternoon was uneventful. I wandered a little, gathered some dry sticks for a small fire, and sat against a tree eating a sandwich I had packed. The woods were calm, but there was always movement. Leaves shaking, birds darting. The occasional snap of a twig felt normal. I didn't think much of it. As the sun started dropping lower, the light shifted. The air cooled, the woods grew darker, and the sounds around me changed. Bird calls stopped, replaced by crickets and faint rustling deeper inside the trees. I lit my small fire before it got too dark, feeding it carefully so it would last through the evening. The flames flickered orange against the trunks of the trees, and for a while it was comforting. I heated a can of beans, ate straight out of it with a spoon, and tried to relax. But as night thickened, I started to feel uneasy. The fire only lit a small circle, and beyond it the woods looked endless. Every sound seemed sharper: the crack of a branch, the shifting of leaves. At one point, I thought I saw movement just beyond the fire's glow, but when I stared hard, it was only branches swaying. I told myself it was nothing, but the feeling of being watched settled over me like a weight. I tried to sleep in the tent, but my ears stayed alert. Every few minutes, I heard something. Sometimes it was faint footsteps, other times a soft scrape. I unzipped the tent halfway, peeking out with my flashlight. The beam caught nothing but trees and grass. The fire had died down, only glowing embers left. It was past midnight when I heard the first sound that didn't feel natural. A long, dragging step, then a pause. Another step. My stomach tightened. I turned off the flashlight instantly, afraid of giving away my exact spot. I lay completely still, holding my breath, listening. The steps were slow, uneven, like someone trying not to make noise but failing. They were too heavy to be a deer or fox. The footsteps stopped somewhere close. I could almost feel the presence, though I couldn't see anything. My heart pounded so loud I thought whoever it was could hear it. Minutes passed, or maybe longer, with nothing but silence. I forced myself not to move, gripping the pocket knife in my hand under the sleeping bag. Eventually, I heard retreating steps, crunching lightly over leaves. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, drifting in and out of half-sleep, jumping at every sound. When the first gray light of morning crept in, I crawled out of the tent. The clearing was quiet again. I walked a small circle around the campsite, trying to see if I had imagined it. And that's when I found the prints. Near the edge of the clearing, just beyond where the firelight would have reached, were faint boot marks in the dirt. They weren't mine. I checked the soles of my own boots. The prints were slightly larger, pressed deep into the ground, showing that someone had been standing there, watching. The realization made my throat dry. I packed my things quickly, shoving everything into my bag without care. I didn't bother with breakfast, just poured dirt over the remains of the fire and strapped my gear on. On the walk back to the road, I kept checking over my shoulder. Every crack of a twig made me freeze. The woods didn't feel peaceful anymore. They felt alive with eyes I couldn't see. My boots scraped the path faster and faster until I finally spotted the road through the trees. But my car wasn't empty. When I reached it, I saw the back door slightly ajar. My chest went cold. I was sure I had locked everything before I left. I stood still for a long time, gripping the knife in my pocket, staring at the door. Slowly, I pulled it open. The back seat was empty, but my backpack that I had left inside the car was unzipped, clothes scattered. Whoever it was had gone through it. The worst part was what I found tucked into the seat pocket. It was a small scrap of paper, folded in half. When I opened it, there was nothing written on it. Just a simple, crude drawing of a tent under a tree. My tent. My hand shook as I held it. I shoved the paper down, threw my bag inside, and slammed the door shut. I didn't care about the noise. I got into the driver's seat, turned the ignition, and drove fast, gravel spitting from the tires as I tore down the road. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the motorway, the woods far behind me. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been stalked all night. Whoever had been out there knew I was alone, knew where my tent was, and had the nerve to go through my car. When I finally got home, I sat in the driveway for a long time, staring at the paper again. The drawing was rough, almost childish, but the message was clear. Someone had been there, watching me in the dark, close enough to hear me breathing inside that tent. I never went camping alone again after that. I was 22 when I decided to go on a short camping trip by myself in New Mexico. It was late October of 2014, and the air had already started to cool down at night. The area I picked wasn't far from the small town of Gallup, out near a stretch of high desert where the ground broke into canyons and mesas. I had borrowed an old tent from my uncle and stuffed it into the back of my car with a sleeping bag, a flashlight, and enough food for 2 days. The drive out was calm. The desert looked endless, with patches of sagebrush scattered across the flat land. I turned down a dirt road that rattled my car until it reached a wider clearing where I parked. From there, I hiked in about a mile, just far enough so I wouldn't hear the occasional vehicle that passed on the highway. The silence was thick, broken only by wind pushing against dry grass and the faint calls of birds. By the time I set up camp, the sun was low, bleeding orange against the horizon. I had brought a small folding chair and sat for a while, eating jerky and sipping water, just staring out into the distance. The desert had a strange way of making you feel like you were being watched. Everything was so open, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the land itself was aware of me. When night fell, it came fast. The stars lit up the sky so bright I barely needed my flashlight. I started a small fire, fed it with sticks and broken branches, and let it crackle while I sat in my chair. The air grew cold quickly, and I pulled my jacket tight. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. I had heard them before on other trips, but out here alone it felt sharper. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. I put the fire out and zipped myself into the tent. The desert quiet was heavy. I could hear my own breathing, the occasional shuffle of wind against the tent fabric, and the sound of insects buzzing. Sometime later, I woke up. I wasn't sure what time it was, but the moonlight made everything outside glow faintly. What pulled me out of sleep was a noise, something moving close by. It was a slow crunch of footsteps on dry dirt and small rocks, and it wasn't the quick trot of an animal. It was heavier, spaced out like a person walking. I froze in my sleeping bag, listening. The steps circled the tent, deliberate and steady, then stopped. My mouth was dry. I wanted to grab my flashlight, but I was afraid to unzip the sleeping bag and make noise. After a long silence, I finally reached out and flicked on the light. I didn't hear anything outside anymore. The air seemed dead. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a stray dog. I stayed awake for a while, heart racing, before eventually dozing off again. The second time I woke up, it was because of a different sound. This time it was something like breathing, low, uneven, just outside the thin layer of nylon that separated me from the night. It was so close I could almost feel it. I held my breath and listened. The breathing went on for a minute or two. Then there was a soft scratch along the side of the tent, slow and deliberate, like someone dragging their fingers down the fabric. I couldn't move. My body locked up, and my mind was racing through every possibility. Maybe someone had followed me out here. Maybe it was a drifter, someone living off the land. The thought of another person being out there, crouched beside my tent, was worse than any animal. After what felt like forever, the scratching stopped. The breathing faded, and I eventually heard those same slow footsteps walking away. I laid there until the first gray light of dawn crept over the desert. When I finally stepped outside, the ground was cold with dew. I looked around the camp. About 20 feet from the tent, there were prints in the dirt. They weren't boot prints. They were bare feet, wide and oddly long, like someone with huge saws had walked circles around me in the night. The skin must have been dry because I could see cracked edges in the dirt impressions. The sight of them made my stomach knot. I told myself I'd pack up and leave, but I wanted to see more first. I followed the prints for a short distance until they broke off into the brush and disappeared. I stopped there. Something about the direction they went felt wrong, like I was being lured farther than I should go. I spent the rest of the day on edge. Every noise carried weight. A bird fluttering out of a bush made me jump. I cooked a small meal of canned beans and bread but barely ate. The thought of staying another night made my chest tighten, but I didn't want to hike back in the dark, so I told myself I'd leave at first light. That night, I didn't light a fire. I thought maybe if I kept quiet, whatever had been out there wouldn't come back. I zipped myself into the tent early and kept the flashlight in my hand. Hours crawled by. My ears strained at every rustle and shift of wind. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard it again. The footsteps. They came from the same direction, slow and careful, crunching over the dirt. My skin went cold. The steps circled the tent again, pausing at random spots. This time, I decided I wasn't going to just sit frozen. I grabbed the knife I had packed for cooking, pulled it close, and waited. The sound stopped right behind me, at the back of the tent. My heart thudded so loud I thought it would give me away. Then I heard a noise I'll never forget. It was the sound of someone trying to mimic a coyote howl. It was stretched, broken, almost human but wrong. It wavered and cracked, like a voice forcing itself into a shape it wasn't meant to take. I wanted to scream, but I bit it down. I gripped the knife so hard my hand hurt. After a few minutes, the sound stopped. Silence pressed in again, thicker than before. I don't know how long it lingered out there. At some point, I heard those bare feet shuffle away into the distance. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning finally came, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, eyes darting everywhere. The footprints were back, circling the tent again, more of them than before, as if it had paced and lingered there for hours. They stretched out into the brush the same direction as yesterday. I didn't waste a second. I tore down the tent, stuffed everything into my pack without caring how it fit, and hiked back to my car faster than I thought possible. The whole way, I felt like I was being watched from the ridges and brush. My skin crawled with every step. When I reached the car and slammed the doors shut, I sat gripping the wheel, shaking. I didn't start the engine right away. I just sat there, staring out at the open desert, half expecting to see something standing in the distance, watching me. Finally, I drove. I didn't look in the rearview mirror, and I didn't stop until I reached the edge of town. I promised myself I'd never camp alone in that part of New Mexico again. To this day, I don't know what I saw or heard out there. I don't know who or what circled my tent in the night, breathing against the thin wall, scratching with dry, cracked hands, and leaving those strange prints in the dirt. But I know it wasn't just an animal, and it wasn't a ghost. It was something that walked on 2 feet, something that knew I was there and wanted me to know it too. That was the last solo camping trip I ever took. I was 21 years old when I decided to spend a few days camping alone in the summer of 2004. I had been saving up for months to buy decent gear, and after working long shifts at a warehouse in Indiana, I wanted quiet, somewhere away from constant noise and people. I chose a small state forest in southern Ohio, not too far from the West Virginia line. It wasn't a famous park, which I liked. Less chance of crowded trails, fewer people nearby. The drive took about 6 hours. I packed my small cooler with water, some bread, jerky, and a few cans of beans. My tent and sleeping bag were stuffed in the trunk along with an old lantern and a cheap folding knife I always carried. The radio barely picked up anything once I got close to the park. By the time I turned off the main road and onto the gravel entrance, I had already stopped seeing houses for a long while. The ranger station was closed when I passed it. A faded paper tacked to the window said self-registration was required, so I dropped $5 into the box and filled out my plate number. The campsite I chose was tucked deeper into the woods, far from the loop where families usually stayed. The dirt pull-off only had room for 1 car. I parked, stepped out, and the first thing I noticed was how heavy the air felt. It was humid, and the woods were thick, green leaves hanging low, blocking much of the sun. The sound of cicadas rattled constantly. I set up my tent slowly, staking it down on a patch of relatively flat ground. The forest floor was soft, with layers of leaves that had rotted into the soil over the years. The smell of wet earth carried everywhere. I lit my lantern once the sun started dropping. Orange light flickered against the thin nylon walls of my tent, but outside of that circle, everything grew dark quickly. The first night, nothing unusual happened. I lay on my back, listening to the bugs and the faint rustle of something moving through brush now and then, probably raccoons or deer. I wasn't worried. I had grown up hiking trails and fishing at night. I drifted to sleep with the buzzing of the forest around me. The second day I hiked. I left the tent pitched and took only a small pack with water. The trail wound uphill, roots twisting across it like veins, and every so often I saw claw marks on trees where bears had scratched. I knew black bears lived in the area, but I carried a small can of spray and figured that was enough. At the top of a ridge, the trees opened just enough to see miles of unbroken forest in every direction. No roads, no towns, just rolling hills covered in endless green. Standing there, I realized how alone I really was. No cell service, no ranger nearby, no other campers that I had seen. Just me. Felt freeing at first, then unsettling. I didn't stay long on the ridge before heading back. That evening, as I was cooking beans over my small stove, I noticed something odd. About 30 yards from my sight, through a tangle of brush, I swore I saw the shape of something pale leaning against a tree. It was there for a second, then gone. I stared until my eyes watered, but all I could see was leaves and shadows. I convinced myself it was a trick of the light, maybe a fallen birch branch catching the last bit of sun. Still, I finished eating quickly and sat closer to the lantern until I went to bed. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't the usual rustle of animals. This was heavier, slower. Footsteps, leaves crushing one at a time. My first thought was a deer. I held my breath, waiting for it to pass, but it circled. The sound went halfway around my tent before stopping. I gripped the knife I had tucked near my sleeping bag, staring at the thin nylon wall that separated me from whatever was out there. After a while, the sound moved off into the woods, quieter, until I couldn't hear it anymore. I barely slept after that. Every creak and shift outside set my nerves off. By morning, nothing looked disturbed. No tracks, no broken branches, just quiet woods. I told myself again it had been a deer, but the more I thought about it, the more I knew deer didn't circle campsites slowly like that. They either moved through or bolted. They didn't linger. The third day, I stayed close to camp. I read a paperback I had brought and kept the fire going, though it was hot. I didn't want to be caught off guard at night. I collected more wood, stacked it high, and kept my lantern ready. When dusk came, I sat on a log with the fire crackling and forced myself to stay awake. Around midnight, I heard it again. This time, the steps were faster, like someone trying to move quietly but not managing it well. They stopped just at the edge of the firelight. I could feel eyes on me, though I saw nothing. My chest tightened. Every instinct screamed at me to grab my stuff and leave, but the thought of running into the dark was worse. I stayed seated, knife in hand, until eventually the sounds faded into the distance. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I decided I had enough. The trip was supposed to be relaxing, but instead I felt trapped, watched. I packed my things quickly, rolling the tent and stuffing it into the trunk. Sweat ran down my back even though the air was still cool. Before pulling out, I walked once more to where I thought I had seen that pale shape 2 nights earlier. The ground there was different. The leaves were pressed down in a rough oval, like someone had been standing there for a long time. And in the dirt, just beneath the scattered leaves, I saw a boot print. Not mine. It was larger, wider, and fresher than any I had left. I drove out without stopping, not caring about the self-registration box or the ranger station. The gravel rattled under my tires as I pushed the car faster than I should have. Only when I reached the main road, with traffic moving in both directions, did my hands start to steady. That was the last time I camped alone. I still hike, still fish, but I never again set up a tent miles from anyone else. It's one thing to know wild animals are out there. It's another to know someone, a stranger, had been walking circles around me in the dark, watching me while I tried to sleep. Even now, I think about the size of that print, the weight it pressed into the ground. Whoever it was, they had been there more than once, standing just far enough away for me to hear but not see. I'll never know what they wanted or why they left when they did. I only know I wasn't alone in those woods, not even for a second. I had decided to go camping alone in the summer of 2016, in a quiet forested area outside of Asheville, North Carolina. I was 23 at the time and thought of myself as experienced enough in the outdoors. I had camped with friends many times, hunted deer with my uncle as a teenager, and even gone backpacking on trails for days at a time. But this was different. This was the first time I had chosen to go completely alone, without telling anyone exactly where I was. That part seemed exciting when I was packing up at home, but I would later realize it was one of the worst decisions I could have made. The drive there was calm, a little over an hour of winding mountain roads with the windows down. The forest looked thick and endless, the trees rising high, their leaves filtering the sun into scattered beams. I pulled off a smaller dirt road that led deeper into the woods. The ground crunched under the tires, and every turn of the road felt like it erased another piece of the outside world. I liked that. I wanted silence, peace, and maybe a test of myself. By late afternoon, I found a flat patch near a slow-moving creek. The air smelled damp and earthy, and the only sounds were insects and the trickle of water. I set up my small green tent on higher ground, collected wood for a fire, and got my things in order. My backpack was stuffed with simple food, granola, jerky, a couple cans of beans, and water filters. I had a hunting knife strapped to my belt and a flashlight clipped to my chest strap. Everything felt under control. The first night was calm. I sat by the fire as darkness closed in, watching sparks jump and vanish into the sky. The woods were alive with sounds. Frogs croaking, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, distant owls calling. I didn't mind any of that. I grew up in the country, so those sounds meant the world was normal. It was sometime after midnight when I first noticed something unusual. I had been half asleep in my tent when I thought I heard something heavy moving through the woods. Not a squirrel or raccoon. It was slower, heavier. I told myself it could be a deer or maybe a bear moving near the creek. I listened harder, lying on my sleeping bag, staring at the nylon ceiling above me. The sound came again, branches snapping under weight. Then silence. My chest felt tight, but eventually I convinced myself it was just wildlife and drifted off. The second day went smoothly. I hiked around, following the creek further down, testing my knife on some old branches and keeping myself busy. I didn't see anyone else out there. Not a single hiker, not a fisherman, not even signs of another campsite. That was what I had wanted, total seclusion. But that night, the strange sounds returned. I had gone to sleep earlier, exhausted from walking all day. Around 1 a.m, I woke up to what sounded like soft, deliberate footsteps in the leaves outside my tent. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but the more I focused, the clearer it became. The steps weren't quick or random like an animal. They were slow. A crunch of leaves, then a pause. Another crunch, another pause. My heart hammered in my chest. I stayed completely still, breathing shallow through my nose. The steps circled near the tent. I didn't move. I didn't even unzip the bag to grab my flashlight. Every sound in the woods felt amplified, but those steps were too close. Then, after what felt like forever, they faded into the distance. I barely slept the rest of the night, gripping the handle of my knife inside my sleeping bag. By morning, I tried to explain it away. Maybe it really had been a large animal. Maybe the echo of the woods made it sound slower than it was. I walked around my campsite, scanning the ground. The dirt and leaves were scattered, but I thought I noticed spots where the leaves looked pressed down, almost like prints. Not boot prints, not clear enough to know. Just disturbed patches. My stomach tightened. I thought about leaving then, packing everything up and heading back. But pride held me there. I told myself I had food, I had fire, I had a knife, and I could handle whatever was in the woods. The third night came, and I dreaded it. I built the fire bigger than usual, feeding it until flames leapt high. I sat awake for hours, watching the shadows jump between the trees. My back ached from sitting so long. My eyes felt heavy, but I couldn't relax. Every crack in the woods snapped me alert. Around 2 a.m, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. It was the sound of something metallic clinking together, faint but distinct, like metal brushing against metal. My stomach dropped. No animal carries metal. My mouth went dry, and I felt cold sweat on my skin even though the fire was throwing off heat. I stayed crouched by the flames, staring into the dark. I never saw anyone, but I knew someone was out there. The sounds stopped after a while, but I didn't sleep at all. When dawn broke, the forest looked calm again, sunlight cutting through the branches, but I didn't feel calm. I decided then I was leaving. I packed quickly, shoving things into my bag without care, stamping out the fire until the ground was blackened and wet. As I hoisted the pack onto my shoulders, I noticed something I hadn't before. About 20 yards away, pinned into the bark of a tree with a rusty nail, was a small strip of torn cloth. It was dirty, grayish, and looked like it had been there for a while, but the way it was nailed up felt deliberate. My chest tightened as I stared at it. I didn't go closer. I turned and started walking fast, almost jogging with the heavy pack bouncing against my shoulders. The trail back felt longer than when I came in, every sound behind me making me flinch. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following. By the time I reached my car, the sky was clouding over, the woods turning darker with the coming storm. I threw the pack in the back seat and slammed the doors locked before starting the engine. My hands were shaking on the wheel as I pulled onto the dirt road. Even as I drove back toward town, the feeling didn't leave. That steady awareness that someone had been there, circling my tent, watching, carrying metal, maybe leaving things behind. Whoever it was, they hadn't shown themselves fully, but I was certain they had been close, and they had been watching me for at least 2 nights. I never went back to that spot. In fact, I stopped camping alone altogether after that. I kept thinking about how easy it would have been for whoever was out there to wait until I was asleep, to step into the tent while I was vulnerable, and I'd never have known until it was too late. The woods were supposed to be quiet and peaceful, but I learned something then. The scariest part of being alone in the wilderness isn't the animals or the dark. It's realizing someone else might be out there with you, and you have no idea what they want. I was 23 in the summer of 2014 when I decided to go camping in an old graveyard outside of Manchester. It wasn't something I usually did. I wasn't the type who chased thrills or messed around with dangerous stunts, but I'd been restless that month. Work was dragging, I didn't have much money for a proper trip, and I wanted to do something that felt different. I had grown up on the edge of towns, where cemeteries were just part of the landscape, quiet stretches of land with stone walls around them. I never thought much of them. I didn't believe in spirits or any of that. A few miles out of the city, there was a cemetery that had been closed for decades. No burials, no services, just a patch of land with leaning stones and tall grass. It wasn't famous or anything, just an old place people didn't visit anymore. I'd biked past it once during the day and noticed the gate was rusted open. The place looked overgrown and forgotten, but it was still shaded by tall oaks and had enough space to set up a tent. I figured it would be quiet and free. I packed light, a small tent, sleeping bag, some food in a backpack, and a flashlight. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. It was one of those impulsive things I didn't want to explain to friends or family, because I knew they'd call it stupid. By the time I pedaled out there, the sun was already dipping lower, the light going soft and gold over the fields. The cemetery sat on a slight rise, bordered by a low stone wall that crumbled in spots. The gate creaked when I pushed it. Inside, weeds pushed up between the paths, and the gravestones were weathered and chipped. Some were tilted so far over they looked like they would fall. The names and dates were faint, some completely eaten away by moss. A few graves had sunken in, leaving dips in the ground. I walked around for a while, studying the place. Felt strange, like stepping into somewhere time forgot. I picked a flat spot near the far edge where a tree leaned over the wall. I set up my tent quickly, before the light disappeared. The ground was uneven, but I cleared away sticks and rocks and made it work. As I unrolled my sleeping bag, I could still hear the distant hum of traffic from the main road, but it faded once the sky grew darker. By the time I had a small lantern lit and sat down with a sandwich, the quiet was thick. First, it was peaceful. Just the sounds of leaves shifting, the occasional bird settling in for the night. I wandered the rows for a while, shining my flashlight over the stones. Some dated back to the 1800s, names long gone from memory. The air smelled damp, earthy, mixed with the faint rot of old wood and wet grass. I tried to imagine the funerals that must have taken place here, the people standing in suits and dresses, mourning people no one remembered now. When it got too dark, I returned to the tent and zipped myself inside. The fabric walls felt thin out there, but I told myself it was fine. I stretched out on the sleeping bag and scrolled my phone for a bit, though I had no signal. Eventually, the battery dropped low, and I shut it off. The lantern flickered softly, throwing shadows against the nylon. It must have been around midnight when I started hearing things. Not voices or anything like that, just small noises in the grass outside. At first it sounded like wind, then like footsteps. Light, uneven steps. I froze, listening. The sound would come and go. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a fox or a badger, but it didn't move like one. It was too slow, too deliberate. I lay there holding my breath, straining to hear. The crunch of grass would circle one side of the tent, then stop. A minute later, it would start again on the other side. My chest tightened. I thought about unzipping the tent and shining my light, but something in me didn't want to. I felt exposed already. If someone was out there, I'd rather not let them know exactly where I was. The noises went on and off for what felt like half an hour. Eventually, they stopped. My eyes burned from staring at the ceiling of the tent, waiting. I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes again, the lantern had burned out. The tent was dark, only faint moonlight seeping through the fabric. My mouth was dry. That's when I noticed the zipper. I had left it pulled shut with the flap pressed down tight. But now it was open just an inch or two, enough to see the teeth parted near the bottom. My stomach dropped. I sat up, barely breathing, and touched it. The zipper felt cold, slightly damp. My hands shook as I slid it back up to the top, making sure it clicked into place. I told myself maybe I hadn't closed it all the way earlier. Maybe I'd been careless. But deep down, I knew I had. I couldn't sleep after that. Every sound outside felt magnified. The rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, even my own breathing. I kept the flashlight in my hand, thumb resting on the switch. Hours dragged. My phone had died, so I couldn't check the time. Felt endless. At some point, I caught a smell. Not the damp earth smell from before, but something sharper, almost sour, like sweat mixed with stale clothes. It lingered outside the tent. I pressed my face against the fabric, holding my breath, and thought I heard someone exhale. That broke me. I yanked the flashlight on, unzipped the tent in one fast motion, and shined the beam across the graves. The light swung wildly across stones and weeds. Nothing. The place looked empty still, but the smell was real, hanging in the air. I left the tent half open and stood there, heart hammering, flashlight shaking in my hand. My bike was locked to the gate on the far side of the graveyard. To get to it, I'd have to cross the whole place. I didn't want to, but staying there felt worse. I stuffed my sleeping bag and lantern into the pack as quickly as I could, not bothering to fold anything, then slung it over my shoulder. The walk to the gate felt endless. My light bounced across the crooked stones, catching shadows that looked like figures until I moved again. My boots crunched on gravel. Every few steps, I glanced behind me, sure I'd see someone there. The smell clung faintly as I went, as if it followed. When I reached the gate, my hands fumbled with the lock on the bike. The key slipped once, then finally clicked it open. I threw the pack into the basket and pedaled as hard as I could down the empty road, not looking back until the cemetery was far behind. I didn't stop until I was nearly back in the city, where the streetlights glowed orange and cars passed again. Only then did I breathe properly. My shirt was damp with sweat, my legs aching from pedaling so fast. I never went back to that place. A week later, out of curiosity, I looked it up online. Turns out, people had reported squatters using the cemetery grounds over the years. Runaways, addicts, people with nowhere else to go. No ghosts, no supernatural nonsense. Just real people hiding in the overgrowth, living where no one bothered to check. Thinking about it afterward chilled me more than anything. If someone had been watching me in that tent, unzipping it while I slept, I had no idea what they wanted. Maybe they just wanted to scare me off. Maybe they were waiting to see if I was alone. All I knew was that I had been lucky to leave when I did. Since then, whenever I pass an old graveyard, I never see it the same way. It's not the dead you worry about. It's the living, the ones who find places like that to hide. And I'll never camp in one again. I still remember the night I camped out on that old farm. It was the summer of 2003, late July, when the heat during the day was almost unbearable, but the nights carried that heavy kind of silence that pressed against your skin. I was 21 back then, restless, and always looking for places to be alone. A friend had told me about a piece of land on the edge of a small town in Kansas where nobody really went anymore. The farm had been abandoned years earlier, or at least that's what people said. I didn't care much about why it was empty. I just wanted space, somewhere off the map where I could put up my tent and get away from the constant noise of town. The drive out there was long, about 40 minutes of two-lane roads with nothing but open fields and scattered barns. The farm itself sat back from the road, with a thin gravel drive that was cracked and swallowed by weeds. A rusted gate leaned sideways at the entrance, chains wrapped around it like someone had given up trying to actually lock it. I pulled my car just far enough off the road, grabbed my pack, and walked in. I told myself it was just camping on private land. Nothing more. I thought I'd be invisible out there. I didn't think about the people who might still watch that place. The air was thick with the smell of dirt and dry grass. The house, a sagging two-story building with peeling white paint, stood crooked against the horizon. Its windows were black holes, broken in some places, boarded in others. The barn was larger. The red siding faded to a dull pink. Its roof bent in the middle like it might collapse with one more storm. The silence was strange. No animals, no crickets at first, nothing but the faint hum of wind. I set my tent up near a patch of trees on the far side of the property, away from the house but close enough to see its outline. The grass there was knee-high, dry and sharp, and I had to stamp down a flat space just to put the tent up. Sweat soaked my shirt, and mosquitoes buzzed thick in the air. By the time I had a small fire going with dry wood I found scattered around, the sun was sliding down behind the fields. The sky turned that strange deep orange before it finally gave in to black. At first it felt like a normal camping trip. I ate out of a can, stretched out by the fire, and tried to enjoy the quiet. But the quiet didn't feel right. It was too heavy. Every small sound carried further than it should have. The crack of wood shifting in the fire, the whistle of wind through broken barn boards, even my own breath seemed louder. I kept looking back at the house, at those empty windows, telling myself it was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the thought that someone could be standing in there, staring out at me. By midnight, the fire was down to glowing coals. I climbed into my tent, zipped it up, and lay on top of my sleeping bag. The air inside was hot and sticky, and I kept rolling, trying to find a cooler spot. That was when I heard it, the sound of gravel crunching. It was faint, drawn out, like slow steps dragging across the driveway. My body went rigid. I held my breath and listened harder. The steps stopped, then started again, closer this time. I thought about the gate, about the chain. Maybe someone had pulled it aside. Maybe I wasn't as hidden as I thought. I told myself it could have been an animal. Coyotes, maybe, or a stray dog. But then I heard a metallic creak, like rusted hinges moving. The barn door. It wasn't loud, but in the dead silence, it was sharp enough to make my heart slam in my chest. I sat up, pressing my ear against the thin fabric of the tent. Nothing after that. Just stillness. Minutes passed, maybe more, maybe less, I couldn't tell. Then came another sound, softer, steady. Footsteps in the grass. Not running, not stumbling. Just a slow, deliberate pace. They weren't far. I could almost tell the weight of them, like a boot pressing down the dry stalks. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. They were letting me know they were out there. I reached for the flashlight beside me, but I didn't dare turn it on. My hands were slick with sweat, shaking so bad I could barely hold it. I thought about unzipping the tent, bolting for my car, but the thought of stepping out into that dark field with whoever was out there froze me in place. The footsteps circled, not directly around my tent but wide, like someone was walking the edges, keeping distance but making sure I knew. Then they stopped. The silence that followed was worse. My chest hurt from holding my breath. I strained my ears, waiting for the next sound. After what felt like forever, I finally heard the grass again, moving away this time, toward the house. The boards creaked faintly, like weight shifting inside. Then nothing. I didn't sleep. I sat there all night, clutching the flashlight, every tiny rustle making me flinch. The tent felt like the weakest barrier, just thin fabric between me and whatever had walked the property. Around 3 in the morning, I thought I heard a car engine in the distance, far off, muffled, then fading. I couldn't tell if it was real or just my imagination stretching thin from exhaustion. When the sky finally began to pale with dawn, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The grass around my camp was bent in places, pressed down in patterns that hadn't been there before. Wide tracks, heavy, not the random scatter of an animal. They circled the spot I slept, then led off toward the house. I walked toward the barn, though every part of me screamed not to. The big sliding door stood half open. I didn't remember seeing it that way when I first arrived. Inside, the dust was thick, the smell of old hay strong, but on the floor near the entrance was a fresh boot print, clear as day, size larger than mine. That was enough. I packed everything in a rush, barely rolling my sleeping bag, shoving the tent into my pack. My hands kept fumbling, my nerves shot. I walked fast back to the road, glancing behind me every few steps. The gate chain had been moved, not unwrapped, just shifted enough that someone could slip through without making much noise. I threw my gear into the car and drove, gravel spitting behind me. My heart didn't slow until miles later, when the farm was well out of sight. Even then, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a truck following me. I never told anyone where I camped that night. I didn't go back, not even during the day. But I know what I heard, and I know what I saw. Someone was still watching that land. Maybe they lived in that house even if it looked abandoned, or maybe they just came back to guard it. Either way, I was on their ground and they wanted me to know it. Looking back now, I realize how stupid I was. I thought empty buildings meant empty land. I thought being young and invisible made me safe. But that night showed me how wrong I was. The farm wasn't empty. It was occupied in a way I'll never fully understand. And the worst part is, I'll never know who it was out there, walking circles around my tent, waiting in the dark while I lay there wide awake, knowing they could have unzipped that thin sheet of fabric any second if they wanted to. That's the memory that still sticks. The idea that they didn't. That they left me there wide awake, knowing I'd get the message. And I did. I never camped on private land again. I was 24 years old when I went camping alone for the first time. It was late September of 2017, and the days were already cooling down in northern Michigan. I had been working in a warehouse in Grand Rapids, and the nonstop noise of trucks and forklifts had been eating at me. I wanted silence. I wanted to get away from screens, alarms, and people. So I threw my tent, sleeping bag, a cheap folding chair, and a cooler of food into the back of my old Honda Civic and drove 3 hours north to a small state forest area that I found marked on a faded map. The drive itself felt peaceful. Long stretches of road cut through thick woods, leaves just starting to turn orange and yellow. The air smelled like pine and the windows fogged when I cracked them open for fresh air. My phone signal died about 40 minutes before I reached the dirt road leading to the forest. I didn't think much of it. In fact, I liked the idea that no one could reach me. The road twisted deeper into the trees. My car bounced over ruts and stones, dust clouds rising behind me. When I finally pulled into a small clearing, I felt like I was hours away from the nearest town. The clearing wasn't an official campsite, just a flat patch of dirt with fire scars in the middle. I parked at the edge, killed the engine, and sat there for a moment listening to the forest. It was so quiet it almost rang in my ears. I set up camp slowly. My tent was one of those cheap dome ones you buy from Walmart, the kind with fiberglass poles that always bend the wrong way. The ground was damp and smelled like leaves that had been rotting all summer. I laid out a tarp under the tent to keep it dry, shoved my sleeping bag inside, and dragged out my chair. I felt proud of myself for pulling it together on my own. The first couple of hours passed calmly. I walked a narrow deer trail behind the clearing, snapping dead twigs under my boots, watching squirrels dart up trees. The sun went down faster than I expected, and the temperature dropped. I built a small fire, heated up a can of chili, and sat in my chair with the kind of tired satisfaction that only comes when you're far from anyone else. That's when I started to notice things. At first it was small, a rustle in the trees a little too heavy to be a squirrel. The way the shadows seemed thicker in one corner of the clearing. I told myself it was just normal forest sounds, animals moving around, nothing strange. But when the fire burned low and I leaned down to throw on another log, I froze. Across the clearing, near the edge where the trees pressed close, I swore I saw movement. A figure, a shape that wasn't a tree trunk or a branch. I stared hard, eyes watering from the smoke. The firelight flickered, and the shadows shifted. Whatever I thought I saw was gone. I stood there for a long time, staring into that spot, heart thudding, until finally I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Still, something about the forest felt heavier. The air didn't move. Not a single insect hummed. The silence was thick enough that I could hear my own blood rushing in my ears. When I finally crawled into my tent, I zipped it shut tight. I lay there on top of my sleeping bag, listening. Every snap of a branch outside made me jolt. Around midnight, I heard it clearly. Slow footsteps on the leaves. Not an animal scurrying. Not the random crash of a branch falling. These were steady, deliberate steps circling the clearing. I held my breath so long my chest ached. My first thought was that maybe it was a deer. But deer don't walk like that. They move quick, nervous, darting. These steps were heavy, human. I slid my hand into my backpack and felt for the only weapon I had. A dull pocket knife with a cracked plastic handle. Felt pathetic in my sweaty palm. The steps stopped somewhere near the car. I waited, straining my ears. Then a metallic clink echoed across the clearing. My door handle. Someone had touched my car door. Cold fear ran through me so hard my teeth hurt. I wanted to burst out of the tent, scream, and scare whoever it was away. But I couldn't move. My whole body was locked. I kept picturing someone standing over my car, pulling on the doors, maybe checking the windows, maybe waiting. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. the forest went quiet again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I lay there staring at the tent ceiling, every muscle tense, waiting for another sound. When dawn finally came, pale and gray through the thin fabric, I unzipped the tent slowly. My car was exactly where I left it. Nothing broken, no sign of anything. The ground, though, told a different story. I could see shoe prints in the soft dirt near the passenger side. Not boots or hiking shoes, just plain sneakers, like someone had walked in from the woods with no gear. The prints circled once around the car, then faded back into the trees. I felt sick looking at them. I wanted to pack up right then and there, but something in me hesitated. Part of me didn't want to believe it. I told myself maybe a hunter passed through, maybe some local kid screwing around. I forced myself to stay. I made coffee on my camp stove, tried to push down the knot in my stomach, and went about the day pretending nothing happened. That night, I built another fire, bigger this time. The woods pressed in even tighter around me. I kept glancing at the tree line, waiting to see something move. When I finally went to bed, I shoved the knife under my pillow. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up to the sound of breathing. Not my own. Outside the thin nylon wall of the tent, I heard slow, heavy breaths, the kind a person makes when they've been walking a long time. I froze. The breathing moved around the tent, dragging in and out, sometimes pausing, then starting again. I could see the faint shadow of feet through the fabric. They stopped right near my head. My heart slammed so hard against my chest I thought it might give me away. I clenched my knife, though I knew if the person ripped open the tent, I wouldn't stand a chance. After a long moment, the breathing drifted away. I waited, trembling, until I couldn't hear it anymore. The instant the sky lightened, I tore the tent down, shoving everything into my car without folding or packing. My hands shook so badly I dropped half my stuff in the dirt. I didn't care. I just wanted out. When I finally turned the key in the ignition, relief flooded me. The engine roared to life, and I backed onto the dirt road fast enough to kick gravel. As I drove away, I looked once in the rearview mirror. At the edge of the clearing, just where the trees began, I saw a man. He was tall, wearing a dirty gray hoodie, standing perfectly still, watching my car leave. His face was shadowed, but I knew he had been there all night, circling, waiting. I didn't stop until I hit paved highway and cell service returned. I pulled into a gas station lot, sat there gripping the wheel, and forced myself to breathe. I never told anyone the full story. I just said I'd had a rough trip and didn't feel like camping anymore. But that image of the man standing at the tree line has never left me. I still wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed one more night, or if I hadn't woken up when I did. I haven't camped alone since. I had been planning the camping trip for weeks. It was late September of 2017. The air was starting to carry that bite of autumn, and the woods outside northern Minnesota always had this heavy, quiet feeling when the leaves began to change. I was 26 at the time and needed a break from work and the city. I packed light, only the essentials, my small tent, sleeping bag, food supplies, and of course my dog, Scout. He was a mixed breed, mostly shepherd, loyal and protective. I had camped with him before, and he always gave me peace of mind. The drive into the forest took hours, and the deeper I went, the fewer cars I saw. The paved road turned to gravel, then eventually into a narrow dirt track that rattled the frame of my old truck. The trail led into an area I hadn't camped in before. I had found it on a forum online where someone mentioned it was quiet, rarely visited, and allowed dispersed camping. That was exactly what I wanted. By the time I parked, the sun was already low, shining through the trees in long golden shafts. The forest was dense, a mix of birch and pine, with the ground covered in layers of damp leaves and moss. The smell of wet earth and sap was heavy in the air. I hiked about half a mile off the road to make sure I was tucked away far from anyone. Scout padded along at my side, his ears twitching as he sniffed the ground constantly. I picked a spot near a small clearing, flat enough to set up the tent but still surrounded by thick trees. From there, I could barely see the faint light of the dirt road through the brush. I set up the tent quickly, staked it into the ground, and gathered some dead wood for a small fire. The air cooled fast as the sun sank, and the forest grew quieter. Even Scout seemed restless, his nose in the air more than usual. I chalked it up to him being in a new environment. The fire crackled low that night as I sat on a log and ate a simple meal of canned beans and bread. Scout stayed close, watching the dark edges of the clearing. It struck me how absolute the silence was once the fire settled into embers. No voices, no distant cars, just the faint shuffle of leaves or a branch creaking somewhere in the distance. When I crawled into my sleeping bag inside the tent, Scout lay right at the entrance like a guard. I trusted him. I knew if anything unusual came near, he'd alert me before I ever heard it. Sometime deep into the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first, but I realized Scout was standing, his body stiff, ears forward, staring at the wall of the tent. I held my breath, listening. At first, I only heard my own heartbeat in my ears. Then faintly, I caught it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving through the leaves outside. They weren't animal steps. They were too heavy, too even. I stayed still, trying not to make a sound. The steps circled, crunching the leaves softly. Scout gave a low growl, the kind that rumbled deep in his chest. Whoever or whatever was out there paused. The silence stretched so long I thought maybe I had imagined it. Then another step, closer this time, just outside the tent. I could make out the faint shift of weight, like someone trying to stay quiet. I felt a cold sweat on my neck. My hatchet was outside, leaning on a log near the fire pit. I cursed myself for not keeping it closer. My knife was in my pack, but reaching for it would mean moving, and I didn't want whoever was out there to know I was awake. The sound came again, another step, then the distinct sound of someone exhaling through their nose. My whole body froze. Scout barked suddenly, sharp and loud, lunging against the tent fabric. The noise outside stopped instantly, then I heard rapid steps retreating into the trees. The crunching faded until there was only silence again. I stayed awake for hours, gripping the knife once I finally worked up the courage to pull it from my pack. Scout stayed tense, his ears turning at every little noise. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of me, and I drifted into uneasy sleep. When I woke up, daylight had already spread through the trees. Everything looked so normal in the morning light that I almost convinced myself it was just some late-night hunter or maybe even my own nerves. But as I stepped outside, I saw the proof. Clear in the damp earth near the tent were footprints. Human. They weren't mine. I checked against the boots I wore. These were larger, heavier, and they circled the tent before heading off into the woods. The realization sank heavy in my chest. Someone had been standing out there in the dark, just watching. I packed slowly, scanning the trees constantly. Scout stayed close, never wandering like he usually did. My hands shook as I rolled up the tent poles and stuffed everything into the bag. I didn't want to seem panicked, but I also didn't want to waste time. The hike back to the truck felt 10 times longer than the way in. Every snapping twig behind me made my skin crawl. Once or twice, I swore I heard movement trailing us, but when I stopped, everything went silent again. Scout's tail stayed low the entire walk, and that alone told me I wasn't imagining it. When I finally broke through the last stretch of brush and saw my truck sitting on the dirt track, I felt a rush of relief so strong my knees almost buckled. I loaded everything into the bed as quickly as I could, urging Scout into the cab. Just as I climbed in and slammed the door, I looked across the narrow road. Through the trees, maybe 30 or 40 yards in, I saw movement. A figure. Someone standing half hidden, watching me. They didn't move, didn't step forward, just stood there in the shadows. I couldn't make out a face, only the outline of broad shoulders and the faint shape of a head. I started the truck immediately, the engine roaring in the still air. When I looked back toward the trees, the figure was gone. I pressed the gas and didn't stop until I hit paved road again. By the time I reached town, my hands had finally stopped shaking. I never reported it. I couldn't give them much detail, and there was nothing anyone could do about footprints in the dirt. But the feeling stayed with me. The thought of someone creeping around my tent in the middle of the night, circling it, listening, waiting. I never went camping alone after that. Even with Scout, even knowing he would have laid his life down to protect me, it wasn't worth it. That trip taught me how thin the line is between peace and danger when you're out there alone. It wasn't ghosts or legends, nothing supernatural. It was something far worse, someone real. And the truth is, I'll never know what they wanted. I still remember the trip I took back in the summer of 2009. I was 27 years old then, and I had just started a job that kept me stuck behind a desk for most of the day. I wanted a break, something that would pull me away from the screen and the constant noise of the city. I had always liked the outdoors, though I wasn't some survival expert. I just enjoyed the quiet. That July, I decided to drive out alone to a spot in northern Arizona, not far from Flagstaff. It wasn't a well-known campground, just a patch of forest land I had read about in a small hiking magazine. The write-up had made it sound peaceful, tucked away from crowds, with pine trees, rocky ground, and wide open space to set up camp. That's exactly what I was looking for. The drive out there was long and dry, the kind of drive where the air outside the car feels like it's baking your skin. The road turned from paved to gravel, then to nothing more than dirt lined with tire tracks. I passed only 2 cars the whole time, both heading the opposite direction. When I finally reached the spot, the sun was hanging low and orange in the sky. The air cooled quickly once I stepped out. The silence of the place hit me harder than anything, the kind of silence where you can hear your own breathing and the crunch of gravel beneath your boots. I unloaded the gear from the back of my car. I had brought a decent 2-person tent, a small propane stove, a sleeping bag, and a cooler filled with water, some sandwiches and snacks. Setting up camp took no more than half an hour. I staked the tent on a small flat area just between 2 tall pines, close enough to the car that I could grab things without walking too far. As the sun went down, the sky turned that deep purple you only see in the desert. I lit a small fire in the pit someone else had built there years before, blackened rocks arranged in a circle. I cooked a simple meal, ate it sitting on a folding chair, and watched the flames twist. I felt calm. No phones, no people, no interruptions. But that first night, I didn't sleep well. I heard noises, small ones at first, snaps of twigs, shuffling in the dry pine needles. I told myself it was animals, probably deer, maybe even just rabbits. Still, every sound dragged me halfway out of sleep. Around midnight, I thought I heard something heavier. Not just the light steps of an animal, but something that pressed into the ground with more weight. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of the tent, waiting for whatever it was to move on. Eventually it did. The sounds faded, and I must have fallen asleep. The next morning, I tried not to think much of it. I boiled water for instant coffee and ate a granola bar. I wandered around a bit, followed a dried creek bed that ran through the trees. The heat of the day came fast, and I spent most of it reading in the shade, occasionally jotting notes in the little journal I had brought. Nothing felt out of place. That evening, I noticed something strange. About 20 yards away from my tent, in a patch of dirt, there were footprints. At first I thought they were mine, but I checked and realized they weren't. The size was bigger than mine, the tread different. Someone else's boots had pressed into the ground recently. The dirt was dry, but the edges of the prints were sharp, not softened by wind or time. They hadn't been there the day before. I told myself maybe it was from a hiker passing through early in the morning, someone I didn't notice, but I hadn't heard anyone. No voices, no cars. That night, I couldn't relax by the fire the same way. I kept glancing into the tree line, staring at the dark shapes between the trunks. I heard the same shuffling noises as the night before, but this time they felt closer. I put the fire out early and climbed into my tent, zipping it all the way closed. I woke around 2 in the morning to a sound that froze me in place. It wasn't the soft shuffle of an animal. It was the metallic click of my car door handle. My heart started racing so hard I could hear it in my ears. I lay there, every muscle tight, listening. The handle clicked again, then stopped. Silence. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe loud. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Then I heard slow footsteps circling my tent, crunching the dry ground, deliberate and heavy. Whoever it was didn't say a word. The steps went around one side, paused, then circled the other. I gripped the small camping knife I kept near my sleeping bag, but it felt useless against whoever was outside. I thought about unzipping the tent and bolting for the car, but if someone was already messing with it, maybe they had disabled it. I forced myself to stay still. Eventually, the steps moved away into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, the ground around my tent was marked with boot prints. Larger, heavier than the ones I saw the day before. They led from the dirt patch straight up to my car, then circled back into the trees. I checked the doors locked, just like I had left them, but the handles had dirt smudges that weren't mine. I packed up quickly. Every sound in the trees made me flinch. I stuffed my sleeping bag into the trunk, yanked the tent stakes out, threw everything into the car without bothering to fold it neatly. As I slammed the trunk shut, I looked up and caught sight of something. Just at the edge of the trees, maybe 50 yards away, a figure stood watching me. The person was tall, dressed in dark clothing that blended into the trees. I couldn't see a face, just the outline of someone standing still, hands at their sides. They didn't move. They didn't step forward. They only stood there. My stomach dropped in a way I'll never forget. I got into the car, locked the doors, and turned the key. The engine started, thank God. I reversed fast, the tires kicking up dust, and spun back onto the dirt track I came in on. I checked the rearview mirror as I drove off, but the figure was gone. I didn't stop until I hit the highway, and even then I kept going until I was miles away. Only when the gas station lights appeared did I finally let myself breathe normally again. I never went back to that spot. To this day, I wonder if the person had been watching me since the first night, waiting for something. I think about the sound of those footsteps circling my tent, the way they never said a word. I still go camping sometimes, but never alone, and never in places that remote. That trip cured me of the idea that being far away from people always means safety. It taught me something else too. Sometimes the scariest thing out there isn't the wilderness. It's whoever else might be hiding in it, waiting for you when you least expect it. I had been planning a short camping trip for months. Work had been wearing me down, and I felt like I needed a break from the noise and the routine. I wasn't after anything adventurous or far away, just a couple of nights on my own in the English countryside, somewhere quiet where I could hike, cook my meals by a small fire, and sleep under canvas without worrying about emails or deadlines. I picked a spot in the Lake District, not too far from Keswick, but far enough off the main trails that I'd have some real privacy. It was late September of 2016, and though the air was getting colder, I welcomed it. The change of season gave the woods a quiet, heavy feeling. The hike to the clearing I chose wasn't too difficult. I had parked in a small gravel levee off a country road, shouldered my pack, and walked for about an hour. The trail thinned into a damp track, flanked by low stone walls, moss climbing over them in soft green patches. The ground was covered in wet leaves that stuck to my boots. I eventually reached a flat area ringed by trees, open enough for a tent but still sheltered from the wind. I felt good about it. After pitching my tent and setting up my small camping stove, I spent the rest of the afternoon wandering, taking photos of the woods and the hills in the distance. The sky dimmed earlier than I expected, heavy clouds rolling in, smothering what little evening light there was. By the time I had eaten, it was properly dark. I zipped myself into the tent with a book and my headlamp. I read until the cold made my hands stiff, then turned off the light. I remember waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of something crunching on leaves. It wasn't close at first, but it was distinct. A deliberate sound, too heavy to be a rabbit or fox. I lay still in my sleeping bag, heart beating fast. For a while, the noise didn't come again. I told myself it was probably just a deer, then drifted back into a shallow sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to find the ground damp with fresh dew. I stretched, made tea, and tried not to think about the night before. The woods were quiet, too quiet in a way, but I shook it off. I hiked further into the hills, carrying only a day pack. I didn't see a single soul the entire time, which I liked. That's why I'd come after all. When I got back to camp, though, something made my stomach drop. The firewood I had stacked neatly by my tent was scattered across the ground. At first I thought maybe I had just left it like that without remembering. But no, I knew how I'd left it. It wasn't just tipped over either. It looked like someone had been picking through it. Nothing else seemed disturbed. My pack was still inside the tent, food untouched, but it made me uneasy. That night I couldn't relax. Every rustle outside felt sharper, every snap of a twig louder. Around midnight, I heard footsteps again, much closer this time. Slow, uneven steps, like someone was trying not to be heard but couldn't quite manage it. I kept perfectly still, barely breathing. The steps circled halfway around the tent, then stopped. I waited. Minutes passed. My whole body was tense, ears straining. Then I heard it. The soft, wet sound of breathing, just outside the thin layer of fabric separating me from the dark. My blood went cold. Whoever it was, they were standing there, listening. I don't know how long it lasted. Eventually, the breathing faded, replaced by the crunch of leaves moving away. I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there until dawn, clutching the small camping knife I had brought, every muscle stiff with fear. In the daylight, I tried to convince myself it wasn't what it had seemed. Maybe a hiker had gotten lost. Maybe some drunk farmer from a nearby village had wandered too far. But when I stepped out of the tent, I saw footprints. They weren't mine. They were larger, the tread deeper, pointing straight toward my camp before circling and leaving back into the trees. I should have packed up right then, but I told myself I could handle one more night. I had planned to, and I didn't want fear dictating my trip. I busied myself with gathering wood, cooking a decent meal, and hiking a little to distract my thoughts. The third night was the worst. I stayed up late by the fire, not wanting to crawl into the tent. The woods stretched out black and silent around me, my little fire a fragile island of light. Every so often I thought I caught movement beyond it, but whenever I looked directly, there was nothing. Finally, exhausted, I doused the fire and zipped myself inside. Hours seemed to pass as I lay awake. Then it started again. The crunch of steps, slow and deliberate. My chest tightened. This time they came straight to the tent, no circling. The sound stopped just feet away. I could hear the fabric shifting slightly, as if someone brushed their hand against it. Then there was a pause, and I heard the faint scrape of a zipper being touched. Not pulled, just touched, tested. My breathing grew rapid, and I pressed a hand over my mouth to keep quiet. Whoever it was crouched there for what felt like forever. Then I heard the sound of something heavy being dropped to the ground. A dull thud like a bag or a tool. I didn't move. Finally, after a stretch of silence so long I thought maybe they had gone, I heard the crunching of retreating steps, fading deeper into the woods. I didn't wait until morning this time. I packed what I could in the dark, hands shaking, and left the rest. The tent, the firewood, even my cooking gear. I just stuffed essentials into my pack, switched on my headlamp, and headed back toward the trail. The hike out felt endless. Every step I expected to see someone between the trees, watching me. The beam of my headlamp bounced wildly with my unsteady pace. The woods seemed to press in, the silence broken only by my frantic breath and the occasional snap of branches underfoot. When I finally reached the road, I almost broke down. My car was still there, sitting lonely in the lobby. I unlocked it with trembling hands, threw my pack in the back, and drove until I reached a lit petrol station miles away. Only then did I stop, sit in the car, and let myself really breathe. I never went back for the rest of my gear. The thought of returning to that spot was enough to make my stomach turn. In the days after, I kept thinking about the way the woodpile had been disturbed, the breathing outside the tent, the sound of the zipper being touched. Whoever that man was, he wasn't lost, and he wasn't just passing by. He had been watching me, waiting, and if I had stayed until morning, I don't know what would have happened. That was the last time I ever camped alone. I still remember the trip like it happened yesterday. It was the summer of 2017, and I had just turned 26. I wanted to clear my head after weeks of stress from work, so I packed up my old blue backpack, my tent, and some food supplies and decided to go camping in a rural area of northern Wales. I had camped before, but never alone, and something about being completely cut off from people seemed both exciting and unnerving. The place I picked wasn't a campsite with other people around. It was farmland that had long since been abandoned, sitting between rolling fields and thick patches of woods. I parked my small hatchback on the edge of a gravel path and hiked in with my dog, Max, a black Labrador who never left my side. The grass was high in some places, and the soil was uneven, but after about 20 minutes of walking, I found a flat patch close to the tree line. It was hidden well enough that no one driving by on the nearby road would notice a tent there. I set up camp slowly, pegging the tent into the ground, laying out my sleeping bag, and putting my food in a cooler. The sun dropped behind the hills quicker than I expected, and by the time I got a small fire going, the air had cooled. Max sat close, chewing on a stick, occasionally pricking his ears at sounds in the trees. I didn't think much of it at first. There were rabbits, foxes, and maybe the odd badger in the area. That first night passed without anything unusual. I woke a couple of times to the distant sound of cars or the creak of branches, but nothing felt wrong. It was the second night when things started to shift. I had gone for a long walk during the day, exploring the edges of the woods. The trees were dense in places, tangled with brambles and ferns, and I got scratched a few times pushing through. I found what looked like the remains of an old shed, with rotting wood and rusted metal sheets fallen around it. The whole area felt forgotten. By late afternoon, I made my way back, cooked some noodles over the stove, and fed Max. When darkness fell, the fire cast small shadows against the trees. Max started acting different. Instead of lying down near me, he kept pacing back and forth, ears pointed, eyes fixed toward the darker part of the woods. I told myself it was probably deer, but then I noticed something strange. The sounds of the forest had died down. No insects buzzing, no rustling in the grass, not even the hoot of an owl, just silence. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. I let the fire die low, zipped myself into the tent, and tried to sleep. Around midnight, I woke to Max growling low, deep in his throat. He was pressed against the tent door, his body rigid. I froze, straining my ears. At first, there was nothing, then faint crunches of footsteps in the grass. They weren't quick, not like an animal darting by. They were slow, heavy, deliberate. I lay there, holding my breath. The steps circled the tent once, then faded toward the woods. I didn't sleep after that. I kept one hand on the flashlight and another on Max's collar. At dawn, I unzipped the tent and checked around. There were marks in the grass, flattened areas where someone had stepped. They were too wide apart to be a small animal. Someone had been out there. The day passed in a haze. I couldn't shake the unease. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I told myself maybe it was just a hiker passing through at night, though that made no sense. Who hikes alone through overgrown farmland in the middle of the night? By the third night, my nerves were shot. I built a larger fire than before, hoping the light would deter anything or anyone from coming close. I kept a small hatchet beside me and kept checking the woods. Max barely sat still. He'd growl, pace, then stare out into the dark. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. The footsteps. This time they didn't circle. They came closer, stopping just beyond the reach of the firelight. I couldn't see anything, but Max lunged forward, barking and snarling. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. Whoever it was stood there, completely silent, not moving, just watching. Then, slowly, the sound of retreating steps faded back into the trees. I barely slept the rest of the night, and when the sun finally came up, I knew I couldn't stay another day. I started packing quickly, shoving everything into my bag without care. I wanted to be gone before nightfall returned. But then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Tied to a branch near the edge of the clearing, about 30 feet from my tent, was a piece of faded blue fabric. It was knotted tightly, hanging down like someone had deliberately left it there. My stomach dropped. That fabric hadn't been there before. The realization hit hard. This wasn't random. Someone had been watching me, maybe marking the spot, maybe planning something worse. I didn't waste another second. I threw everything in the car and drove out along the gravel road, glancing in the rearview mirror over and over. Max sat in the back seat, panting heavily, still restless. The relief of seeing the main road almost made me lightheaded. When I finally got home, the silence of my apartment felt unreal after those nights in the woods. I unpacked slowly, still replaying every sound, every step in my head. I kept thinking about the fabric tied to the branch. That detail stayed with me more than anything else, because it meant I hadn't imagined it. It meant whoever was out there wanted me to know they had been close enough to mark my campsite while I was inside that tent, completely unaware. That trip changed the way I thought about camping. I had always seen the woods as a peaceful escape, but now I understood how much danger can come from people, not animals or anything supernatural. I haven't camped alone since, and I don't think I ever will again. Every time I think about it, I picture that silent figure standing just beyond the firelight and the knot of fabric swinging gently in the morning breeze.